What if everything you thought you knew about American history was a lie? Imagine a continent filled with towering cities, intricate trade networks, and scientific advancements that rivaled Europe's greatest achievements long before Columbus ever set sail. These civilizations weren't myths. They were real. They were thriving. And then they were erased. Tonight, we uncover the hidden history of America, a story of brilliance, betrayal, and buried truths. From lost cities larger than London to democratic systems that influence the US Constitution. This is the past they didn't want you to remember. Stay with me until the end, and you'll never see history the same way again. Let us begin. The civilization that vanished from history. Historical records suggest that long before Columbus set foot in the New World, thriving Native American civilizations had already flourished across the continent, one of the hidden secrets of Native Americans that history fails to highlight. A civilization with cities as grand as London, with trade networks stretching across a continent, with governance and science that rivaled, if not surpassed, the old world. But if that's true, why don't we hear about it? Take Cahokia, a metropolis near present-day St. Louis. At its peak, it was larger than many biggest European cities, home to tens of thousands, with a structured government, sophisticated astronomy, and massive earth pyramids, one taller than the Great Pyramid of Giza. Its roads and trade routes connected distant cultures across the continent. And yet, most people have never heard of it. Why? Because acknowledging these achievements disrupts the myth that America was an empty land, waiting for European civilization. It forces us to recognize that what followed reshaped the continent in ways that history often overlooks. Spanish explorers recorded their awe at the cities of the Aztecs and Maya, then burned their libraries, ensuring knowledge was lost forever. If these civilizations were so advanced, what happened to them? Who ensured we forgot? Because what followed wasn't just colonization, it was intentional rewriting of history. And to uncover the depth of this deception, we must go back to the lost civilizations of Native America. Before colonization, the lost civilizations of Native America. Imagine standing in a bustling city plaza surrounded by towering earth pyramids as traders exchange exotic goods. Engineers maintain irrigation canals while astronomers track the stars with precision rivaling early Europe. This was North America, centuries before European contact. So, where did these cities go? And why don't we hear about them? The Native American history before colonization reveals that the land we now call the United States was home to a thriving network of civilizations, organized, powerful, and advanced in ways that challenge everything we've been led to believe. Archaeological findings reveal that Cahokia, near present-day St. Louis, was one of the largest pre-colonial cities in North America. Around 1100 AD, it may have housed over 40,000 people, rivaling the size of many European cities at the time. With advanced urban planning, roads, irrigation, and even sanitation, it rivaled Old World civilizations. Its most remarkable structure, Monk's Mound, was larger at its base than the Great Pyramid of Giza, built without metal tools, an engineering marvel largely ignored by history. Cahokia was not alone. Across the continent, lost native cities flourished. The ancestral Puebloans of Chaco Canyon built vast stone complexes aligned with celestial events, some with hundreds of rooms, showcasing a sophisticated society that endured for centuries. The Mississippian cultures developed sprawling urban centers linked by extensive trade networks stretching from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. Meanwhile, the mound builders of the Ohio Valley created massive geometric earthworks so precise they aligned with solstices and lunar cycles, revealing an advanced understanding of astronomy. By the time Europeans arrived, many of these cities were already in decline, likely due to climate shifts, resource depletion, or internal conflicts. But they were never savage tribes. They had built thriving civilizations with a rich Native American culture before colonization. Their achievements were buried, their history dismissed, because acknowledging them would shatter the myth of an untamed wilderness. Instead, a thriving world of science, politics, and culture was deliberately put into ignorance. But how advanced were these societies? Really? Let's take a look at something history books barely mention. The vast trade empire that connected the continent long before European ships ever arrived. History isn't just written by the victors, it's owned by them. These civilizations didn't disappear. Their stories were deliberately overlooked. But we have the power to bring their voices back. If you believe this history deserves to be known, if you believe these stories should no longer be buried, help us spread the truth. Hit like so more people see this. Subscribe to uncover more hidden histories that challenge everything we've been told. Because when we reclaim the past, we reshape the future. A continent without borders. The Native American trade empire. The traditional narrative paints Native American societies as isolated and primitive, but the reality is far more remarkable. Long before European colonization, North America was a vast, interconnected trade empire spanning from the Arctic to the Caribbean. Goods, ideas, and technology flowed across the continent, creating a complex economic system rivaling the world's greatest civilizations. Before European roads, before the first colonial settlements, indigenous civilizations had already mapped out the continent. They built vast, engineered trade routes that spanned thousands of miles, connecting distant cultures in ways history barely acknowledges. The Great Hopewell Road stretched across the Ohio Valley, linking sacred ceremonial sites. Further west, the Chaco Road system connected the monumental stone cities of the ancestral Puebloans, designed for large-scale transportation, not just foot traffic. These weren't primitive trails. They were highways of commerce, and the scale was staggering. Anthropologists believe that by the time Columbus arrived, trade networks spanned the entire continent from the Arctic to the Caribbean, connecting distant cultures in ways that history has largely overlooked. Gulf Coast shells were found in the Great Plains. Copper from the Great Lakes was shaped into tools in the Southwest. Volcanic glass from Yellowstone made its way to the Appalachians. These weren't isolated tribes. They were part of an economic web rivaling the great trade empires of history. But this system didn't just vanish, it was dismantled, because acknowledging its existence would challenge the very foundation of the colonial narrative. Cahokia's vast trade empire facilitated the exchange of pottery, textiles, and exotic foods across North America. The Chinook of the Pacific Northwest developed a universal trade language, allowing diverse tribes to do business long before Europeans imposed their own. Meanwhile, civilizations in the Southwest traded turquoise, macaw feathers, and cacao with Mesoamerican societies, linking them directly to the great civilizations of the Aztecs and Mayans. Trade wasn't just about goods. It was a powerful exchange of knowledge, Native American technology, and ideas that connected indigenous cultures in ways history has largely overlooked. European settlers were astonished by native engineering. Some cities had irrigation, canals rivaling those of ancient Mesopotamia, sustaining desert civilizations. Others built vast earthworks aligned with celestial movements, showcasing advanced astronomy. In South America, native engineers crafted some of the world's oldest suspension bridges from woven plant fibers strong enough to support entire communities. And yet, these achievements were dismissed, downplayed, or unrecognized because they didn't fit the narrative of European superiority. The trade networks that once connected the continent were deliberately dismantled. The roads that had guided generations were forgotten. The economic power of native societies was systematically crushed. But there was one aspect of indigenous civilization that couldn't be ignored. A system so advanced that even the founding fathers had to acknowledge it before they decided to rewrite history. Because while Europe still clung to monarchy, many native societies had already mastered democracy. The democratic system before America, native governance and law. We're taught that democracy began in ancient Greece, evolved in Europe, and was introduced to America by the founding fathers. But long before the US Constitution, a thriving democratic system already existed here. It emphasized representation, consensus, and balance, directly influencing the United States. So why is it rarely mentioned in history books? Historical records suggest that centuries before the Declaration of Independence, the Iroquois Confederacy had already united 6 native nations under the Great Law of Peace, a sophisticated system of governance based on representation and collective decision-making. The Council of Sachems, chosen by consensus, contrasted sharply with European monarchies. Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson studied this system while drafting the US Constitution, recognizing its success in uniting states without constant war. Yet, the founders deliberately omitted its influence, because admitting it would mean America's democracy wasn't entirely new. Beyond the Iroquois, many indigenous nations had advanced governance systems that rivaled European models. The Cherokee Nation established a 2-house government, mirrored by the structure of the US Senate and House of Representatives. The Muscogee Confederacy operated under a council system, where each town had a voice in larger decisions. Meanwhile, the Pueblo peoples combined religious and political leadership to maintain social harmony, demonstrating a unique theocratic democratic system. And here's something most history books won't tell you. These systems often provided more rights and freedoms than European governments at the time. In many native societies, women held significant political power, something rare in 18th century Europe. Among the Iroquois, clan mothers had the authority to choose and remove leaders, ensuring no decision was made without their approval. Many indigenous legal systems granted women rights that European women wouldn't gain for centuries, including property ownership, divorce, and leadership roles. Some nations, like the Hopi, followed matrilineal traditions where inheritance and political influence passed through the mother's line. Meanwhile, in colonial America, women were still considered the property of their husbands. So which society was truly more advanced? This history was buried for a reason. European colonizers justified their expansion by portraying native societies as primitive. Admitting their influence on American democracy would mean acknowledging they were thriving, self-sufficient nations, not savages in need of civilization. But if native societies were already advanced, what excuse remained for their forced removal? That's when history took a darker turn. The irreversible change done to these civilizations wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. But what happens when an empire is too advanced to ignore? You erase it. Next, we uncover how colonization dismantled an entire continent's way of life, and the dark methods used to erase it. Colonization, the destruction of a civilization. For centuries, the myth endured that European settlers brought civilization to an empty, untamed land. But the colonization of Native American societies tells a very different story. The truth was far different. They arrived to find organized societies, thriving cities, and vast trade networks. Instead of learning from them, they systematically dismantled them. European colonizers quickly recognized that indigenous people possessed valuable knowledge they could exploit. Native agricultural techniques enabled settlers to cultivate essential crops like corn, beans, and tobacco. Indigenous medical practices provided remedies that influenced modern medicine, while native engineering innovations, such as irrigation and city planning, were quietly adopted into colonial settlements. Yet while settlers eagerly took from indigenous knowledge, they ignored its origins. Native contributions were either absorbed without credit or actively suppressed, reinforcing the myth that indigenous societies were primitive. Imagine centuries of knowledge gone in flames, an entire history reduced to ash. One of the greatest losses to native civilizations was the deliberate erasure of their written and oral records. Spanish conquistadors burned thousands of Aztec and Maya books, wiping out entire libraries. Indigenous oral traditions were suppressed as children were forced into boarding schools where their languages were banned. Sacred sites and monuments, once testaments to native achievements, were looted, destroyed, or left to decay, rewriting history through silence. The goal was clear. If the achievements of native civilizations were forgotten, then no one would question the narrative that European civilization was superior or ask how Native Americans lost their land. To justify colonization, Europeans needed a legal and moral excuse to take indigenous lands. The solution was simple: erase native sovereignty from history. Settlers claimed that the land was terra nullius, or nobody's land, despite the fact that it had been home to thriving nations for thousands of years. Laws were passed that defined indigenous people as subjects, not citizens, stripping them of any legal claim to their own homelands. And when native groups resisted, when they fought to defend their territories, the response was immediate. From the moment Europeans arrived, conflicts arose. Colonizers saw native tribes as obstacles, leading to conflicts, land theft, and forced labor. The Pequot War suppressed entire villages, while the Powhatan who once aided Jamestown settlers, were repaid with broken promises and war. In Spanish territories, indigenous people were forced into brutal labor under the encomienda system. But colonization wasn't just about land, it was about removal, leading to one of the largest cases of indigenous displacement in America. Entire nations would soon be uprooted, marched thousands of miles from their homelands, in an event so devastating, its impact is still felt today. Next, we uncover a deeply impactful chapter in American history. The Trail of Tears and Forced Relocation. They didn't just take the land, they tried to erase the very identity of those who lived on it. But this forgotten history is resurfacing. If this history has shocked you, if it has made you question everything you were taught, then don't let it be forgotten again. Hit like to push this story into the light. Subscribe to our channel to be part of the movement reclaiming what was stolen by rewritten history. Because when the truth is shared, it cannot be forgotten. The Trail of Tears and Forced Relocation. By the early 19th century, the US sought total control of the continent, but millions of indigenous people stood in the way. The solution: forced relocation. Entire nations were relocated, often under dire conditions, changing the course of their history. It remains one of the darkest chapters in American history, with lasting consequences. But what really happened during the Trail of Tears? And why is its full horror still downplayed? In 1830, President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act, forcing native tribes west of the Mississippi under the guise of protection. In reality, it was a land grab, targeting thriving nations like the Cherokee, Muskogee, Seminole, Chickasaw, and Choctaw. Treaties and governments meant nothing. The US had already decided to erase native sovereignty. Over the next decade, around 100,000 indigenous people were forcibly removed in the Indian Territory relocation to what is now Oklahoma, with no provisions or preparation. The Choctaw, the first expelled in 1831, lost 4,000 to exposure, disease, and starvation. In 1838, the Cherokee, despite winning a legal battle, were betrayed and forced on an 800-mile march where 1 in 4 perished. The Seminoles resisted for 7 years, fighting the longest native resistance against US forces. And yet, this suffering was not enough for the US government. Even after relocation, native people were denied citizenship, stripped of rights, and pushed into starvation in lands that were supposed to be their new home. The US government claimed that Indian Territory would belong to the relocated tribes forever, but forever turned out to be just a few decades. As settlers moved west, the US broke its promises again, seizing native land and dismantling tribal governments, continuing the long history of Native American land loss. By the late 1800s, even Indian Territory was no longer safe, as native languages were banned and children were forced into brutal boarding schools. And in 1907, the final broken promise came. Oklahoma became a state, and Indian Territory was silenced forever. The Trail of Tears is often taught as a tragic but necessary event, a regrettable chapter in history. But this wasn't just an unfortunate accident. It was a carefully planned system of removal, meant to wipe out indigenous sovereignty entirely. This was not just displacement, it was a calculated removal of native sovereignty, and yet, despite everything, despite forced removal, violence, and broken promises, indigenous identity survived. Tribes rebuilt, resisted, and fought to preserve their cultures, even as the US government tried to erase them. But the war against native identity was far from over. Because after they took the land, they came for something even more sacred: native culture itself. The suppression of native identity. Taking the land wasn't enough. Even after entire nations were forcibly removed, even after treaties were broken and homes stolen, US government policies on Native Americans continued shaping native identity and cultural integration, sometimes with unintended consequences. For centuries, indigenous people had built civilizations, developed languages, and passed down knowledge that spanned generations. But to maintain control, colonizers knew they had to do more than just displace native communities. They had to make sure their history, culture, and way of life disappeared forever. Anthropologists believe that this was not merely an accident, but part of a broader system aimed at assimilating indigenous communities by suppressing their languages, beliefs, and heritage. And the scars still exist today. The most effective way to erase a culture is to target its children. In the late 19th century, the US government launched native boarding schools to erase indigenous identity through forced assimilation. Children as young as 5 were taken from their families, banned from speaking their languages, and stripped of their traditions. Those who resisted faced harsh punishments, while their names, appearance, and culture were systematically forgotten. And it worked. Over 350 native boarding schools operated across the United States, stripping generations of indigenous children of their language and identity. Many never returned home. Some died in these schools, buried in unmarked graves, their names removed from history. But that was just the beginning. Even after forcing native children into boarding schools, the US government continued its assault on indigenous identity by criminalizing native culture. The Indian Religious Crimes Code of 1883 banned sacred ceremonies and traditional healing practices, making their observance punishable by law. The Dawes Act of 1887 dismantled communal land ownership, forcing indigenous families into individual land parcels, many of which were later taken by white settlers. Missionaries were sent to native communities to impose Christianity, condemning indigenous beliefs as heathen or evil. By the 20th century, even speaking a native language in public could result in arrest, further erasing indigenous identity. And shockingly, it wasn't until 1978, less than 50 years ago, that the US government finally lifted its ban on native religious practices. That means, for most of American history, indigenous spiritual traditions were restricted. But even after all this, native identity was never forgotten. Despite relentless efforts to erase their culture, indigenous people resisted. Families secretly spoke their languages, passing them down despite the risk of punishment. Tribal communities preserved their oral histories, ensuring their stories survived even without official recognition. In the 20th century, the American Indian movement emerged, fighting for recognition, reclaiming seized land, and defending indigenous rights. A struggle that continues today. And now, the tide is turning. Many indigenous languages, once thought lost, are being revived. Native religious practices are protected by law. And the brutal truth about the boarding school system is finally being exposed. But the fight isn't over, because even today, many Native communities are still battling for what was stolen. They are still fighting for land, justice, and recognition. And some of them have taken their fight all the way to the Supreme Court. Next, we uncover how Native Americans are still fighting for sovereignty today and winning. The fight for recognition and sovereignty today. Native Americans are still battling for sovereignty, land rights, and justice, challenging broken treaties and unpaid reparations. While some victories, like the 2020 Supreme Court ruling on tribal sovereignty in Oklahoma and a 2012 $3.4 billion settlement, mark progress, they represent only a fraction of what is still owed. The fight for indigenous justice is far from over. Land theft didn't end with the Trail of Tears. Indigenous groups continue fighting to reclaim sacred sites, restore land, and protect their homelands. The Standing Rock Lakota opposed the Dakota Access Pipeline, while Native advocacy led to the restoration of Bears Ears protections in 2021. The Lakota Nation refuses a $1 billion settlement for the Black Hills, insisting on the return of their land. The fight for sovereignty extends beyond land to law enforcement, child welfare, and voting rights. Native American tribes are meant to be sovereign nations, yet the US government continues to undermine their authority. The Indian Child Welfare Act, designed to keep Native children within their communities, was challenged in 2023. Highlighting the fragility of tribal protections. Many Native communities lack jurisdiction over crimes on their land, forcing them to rely on federal or state law enforcement, leaving serious offenses, especially against Native women, unpunished. Voting suppression remains another obstacle, with restrictive ID laws and distant polling places disproportionately affecting indigenous communities. At every turn, Native nations are still forced to fight for basic rights: the right to govern themselves, the right to protect their children, the right to vote, and the right to live on their own lands without interference. And yet, despite centuries of struggle, Native people are still here, still resisting, still reclaiming what was seized. But the biggest question remains: what if history had told the truth about the fate of Native Americans? Imagine a world where Native civilizations were never colonized, where their democratic systems, their environmental knowledge, their advanced engineering, and their vast trade networks had been allowed to flourish. Imagine if history books told the real story of a land that was never empty, of civilizations that were never primitive, of a people who were never conquered, but systematically displaced into non-existence. What if we acknowledged the full extent of what was lost? What if, instead of burying this history, we brought it to light? The truth is, indigenous history is still being written. The fight is not over. And as more Native voices rise to reclaim their past, one thing becomes clear: they were never just victims. They were never forgotten. And they were never defeated. What if history had told the truth? For centuries, the story of Native America has been told from the perspective of the conquerors. A story that framed indigenous people as scattered tribes, as obstacles to progress, as a people doomed to fade into history. But that was never the truth. The truth is, before European contact, native civilizations thrived. They built cities larger than London, engineered vast trade networks, pioneered democracy, and developed scientific advancements that rivaled those of Europe. And yet, their achievements were deliberately ignored, their lands stolen, their cultures outlawed, their children taken. But they never disappeared. Despite colonization, displacement, and systematic attempts to erase them, indigenous nations survived. And today, they are still fighting, not just for recognition, but for their rightful place in history. History books rarely ask, what if? What if native civilizations had never been disrupted? What if indigenous governance had shaped modern democracies more openly? What if their scientific advancements had been preserved rather than destroyed? What kind of world would we live in today? Because here's the unsettling reality. Native America wasn't some distant, primitive past. It was a sophisticated, thriving world that was stolen, rewritten, and buried. But the truth cannot stay hidden forever. Native American contributions to American culture remain deeply embedded in modern society, often without recognition. Nearly 60% of the world's crops, including corn, potatoes, tomatoes, and chocolate, originate from indigenous farming techniques. Native healers pioneered early painkillers, antiseptics, and treatments for fever and wounds, influencing modern medicine. The Iroquois Confederacy served as a model for the US Constitution, though its impact was largely forgotten. Indigenous ecological knowledge, from controlled burns to sustainable agriculture, is now being studied as a method to combat climate change. For a civilization that was supposedly lost, its influence is everywhere. The untold story of Native America reveals resilience, innovation, and a civilization that endured against all odds. It is the story of a people who endured the worst horrors of colonization, forced removal, cultural erasure, and centuries of broken promises, and still refused to disappear. They fought back, they rebuilt, they reclaimed their languages, their traditions, and their sovereignty. They were never just victims. They were warriors, builders, leaders, and they are still here. And today, they are telling their own story. If history had told the truth from the start about native civilizations, their advancements, and their resilience, how different would the world be today? And perhaps more importantly, what can we do now to make sure their story is finally heard? History isn't just written by the victors. It's rewritten, reshaped, and very often also buried. But today, we've uncovered a fraction of the truth. If you're ready to go even deeper into the darkest, most hidden parts of history, watch our Dark History playlist next. Because the past isn't just behind us. It's still shaping our world today. If this story has changed the way you see history, hit like to make sure it reaches more people. Subscribe so you never miss another untold story. Good night.